good morning, everyone. I guess that most of you, including the young people that I see in the audience, have at least once in your life opened an electronic device and looked inside, maybe to understand how it works or maybe to repair it. And most likely, you have seen lots of integrated circuits like this one. And this is where, inside these devices, most of the complexity is hidden. Under this plastic hood, there is a chip, like this one, which is most of the time made of silicon. Silicon technology is one of the most fantastic technologies of mankind because it allows people to make devices which are so complex by containing up to 100 billion transistors. This is 10 transistors for every person on Earth, to make a comparison, and usually each and every single one of these transistors works. There is a problem, however, which is that most of these silicon chips are literally black boxes, not only because they're encompassed in this black plastic, but they're really secret. And with this, I mean that the layout is practically always secret. And if you're lucky, maybe sometimes you get a bit of the high-level description of the chip in open source. If you're lucky, also maybe sometimes these chips use an open instruction set like RISC-V, but that usually does not mean that the chip is open source. And this has, for our life, very important consequences. One of them is that there is a limited security of these chips because people can put in them things that you don't know they exist. And so people don't trust them. And most importantly for the open source movement, you cannot share these designs because they're secret in the first place, since there is nothing to share. So these security issues are not just a speculation. They have been shown in the last years in a multitude of cases. An important example was the one of Intel. I have not the time to go into details, but you can download the slides and then look at all the references. But I want to stress one slide which comes from the leaks of Edward Snowden, which I love because it has as a title, NSA Strategic Partnerships. And in the list of these NSA partners, beyond IBM or Microsoft, you also find Intel. And you may therefore ask the question, is that vulnerability a bug or is it a feature? It does not need a chip to be very complex, like a microprocessor, to contain hardware vulnerabilities. An example of this is the identity card of the Estonian government, which was affected by a pretty obvious vulnerability. It was not disclosed in the public, therefore people could not review it. But later on it was discovered and led to the government to take back almost 1 million identity cards. So let me come to the core of this talk. So the definition of open source silicon. So open source silicon, or an open source silicon chip, is a chip which is open in its entirety. And with this I mean all the way up to the high-level description of this chip, down to the layout. With the layout is shown, for example, in this image here, and it's basically what you send to the foundry for them to fabricate your chip. Once you have the layout published, you can also, as one of the many effects, compare it eventually with a microscope image of the fabricated chip. This is, by the way, one of the chips we fabricated in our labs. Now, I want to convince you that it's not enough to think of open source alone when it comes to open source silicon chip. You need also other elements to be open source, and these are the so-called PDK and the ETA. So when you make a chip, you basically need, first of all, to decide to which foundry you're going to fabricate this chip. It could be an old node, it could be an advanced node, it could be bulk SOI, bulk silicon or SOI, and therefore the foundry is going to send you usually a few gigabytes of data containing very specific technological details about their foundry. This information then goes through a highly automated tools known as electronic design automation, EDA tools, and out of this comes finally, after a lot of work, now this is super simplified design flow, comes finally your layout. Now I want to convince you that both of them need to be open source as well, so let me start. So about the foundries, the matter of fact is that most foundries today don't give you this PDK, this process design kit, just like this. They require you to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, which forbids you from publishing any information contained in this PDK. And this includes the layout of the transistors. Therefore, you see, this is a showstopper. Unless you have open source PDK, you cannot publish an open source silicon chip, according to the definition I just gave. Fortunately, since 2019, there are 3 foundries which have published or are in the process of publishing a PDK. Most notably in Europe, we have IHP Microelectronics, which is close to Berlin. And coming now to EDA, the situation with the EDA is very strange because EDA, the mainstream EDA vendors, force you to sign a contract saying that you will not publish anything generated with their tools. This is quite absurd. Think, for example, you're writing a book with Microsoft Word, and then you've finished the book and you want to publish, and comes Bill Gates knocking at the door and says, no, you cannot publish the book because this might reveal the secret grammar error correction algorithms. So there is some logic behind this secrecy, like they don't want you to understand how the place and route algorithm works, for example, but this obviously does not allow you to publish anything, therefore is a showstopper for open source silicon. Since there are no commercial alternatives in practice, this means that you have to use open source EDA tools as well. Now, these are sufficient conditions to ask for open source EDA, but there are actually a number of other good reasons for using open source EDA, and here are the few. The most important is possibly for companies, the very high license costs. Think that one full license of one of these mainstream EDA vendors is in the range of 1 million, 2 million euros per license per year. Most SMEs, startups cannot afford this, so they beg these companies, please make a discount that sometimes can be 99% discount, but then they want to see secrets of you. They want to see your business plan. They want to see what you want to sell. And this obviously opens the door to geopolitics. Are you building something which is competing with our own interests? Well, then you don't get the discount. Open source EDA also has other advantages. Of course, it allows an incredible flexibility. You don't need to ask permissions. Can I please have a tool doing this and this? You just go out there and you hack it on your own. It prevents lock-in threats. NVIDIA with the RISC-V adoption is a recent example, very, very interesting. It protects you from embargo risks. You have seen what happened to China. Maybe it could happen tomorrow with Europe as well. You don't have access any longer to our tools. Of course, a lot of legal burden. Actually, in open source, there is nearly none when you use the EDA tools. And my favorite is democratization. So why should you wait to enter an Ivy League university or a top university to have access to these tools when you could just go home and download EDA tools and recompile your identity card from scratch? So what is the ecosystem at the moment? A colleague of mine, Thomas Kramer, also in the Free Silicon Foundation, has collected and monitored about 300 tools that are representing this picture. You're not supposed to read this picture. This picture should just give you an idea of how complex the ecosystem is. And this opens the question of how can public funding, at least, most effectively foster the ecosystem. We have seen the talk of Emily this morning, fantastic, about how companies can actually engage in making the ecosystem economically sustainable. But here I'm talking about public funding. And so let's look at what the United States have done. The United States, through a DARPA project, DARPA is essentially a military arm, they have funded a project called Open Road, which is today essentially the de facto standard in open source EDA tools because it's extremely good compared to all the rest of the competition. And the one interesting requirement was that all the software has to be permissive. So DARPA, when they funded this project, they wanted to foster their domestic proprietary EDA companies. Therefore, they made sure that these companies could copy the best of the open source, close it again, so they were permitted to close it. That's what permissive means, permitted to close the software again, and then ship it again. Unfortunately, one of these companies, when speaking to a senator, that's what the voices say, and a senator basically made sure that the project was shut down. So since December last year, this project no longer receives public money, but of course still survives because the tools are good. Interesting to see is that it received peanuts money. So 3 million a year is nothing compared to other budgets that we have seen, like in the CHIPS Act, etc. And they have done a number of tapeouts. They claim up to 600 tapeouts, and they even tackled very advanced nodes like the 12 nanometer node. Interesting articles who tested these things independently are mentioned here, so you're welcome again to download the slides and then look at the details. What happens in Europe? In Europe, we have a fantastic project which does cascade funding, or micro grants. So basically, anyone can apply, including you. You don't need an affiliation. You can be working in the mountains and just get 50K a year, and you receive this money once you have done some of the deliverables that you have written in your project. They have funded already a number of significant projects in the ecosystem like this one. And on the other side, European policy is also working a bit on a higher level, and you have certainly heard about the CHIPS Act. However, the CHIPS Act does not contain a single mention to open source in the way I mean it. Once they mention it in a different context. However, if you look at the goals of the CHIPS Act, it naturally calls into question the use of open source. They just nominate it, and we have analyzed it in a roadmap, which is in reference to, is openly accessible. And so it's interesting to see how they think. Out of the CHIPS Act comes also the CHIPS joint undertaking, which is a little bit more friendly with open source. There are a few mentions. One of them is mentioned here. But still, we think that their goal of making a cloud where these proprietary EDA tools have the prominent position is a way to gather even more customers under that umbrella of the proprietary tools. So we would like them to be a little bit more active, a little bit like copying the US style maybe, in fostering the open source ecosystem, because there is a lot they could do if they wanted to do. Now, before concluding, just very brief mention. So licenses are at the core of the free software movement because it allows really legally to enforce these freedoms that we heard of today. Unfortunately, the GPL version 3, which is the standard free and open source license, enforcing the forever openness of the code thanks to this beautiful hack called copyleft, which exploits copyright, ironically, probably does not work on protecting silicon. There is another license called CERN OHL version 2, which does protect hardware, in particular also silicon, but unfortunately is not compatible with the GPL licenses. Therefore, you cannot include any projects with GPL in your project. And therefore, under the GoIT project, which is this European project we're working on, we're currently developing a GPL-compatible license for silicon. So if there is any one of you interested in this topic, please approach me. And with this, I think already at the end of time, I'd like to conclude and mention, of course, who funded me, so the GoIT project, the European Commission, and I'm open for questions. Thank you. So, are there any questions?
So you are working in a new license, especially to be compatible between GPL and open hardware or silicon. But what is why you think is important to be compatible with GPL3? Only this question.
Well, not necessarily only GPL version 3, but in general with the GPL, AGPL as well. So just GPL version 3 or GPL VX plus. Just because in the domain of silicon, there is not a clear boundary between software and hardware. And when you generate, for example, standard cell compilers, you may even use the BLAST or the LAPAC library, so something which comes completely from the software domain. And since there is not this clear boundary, it's likely that there are projects which take a little bit from code which has previously been licensed under GPL, and you don't allow people to do that. So people should be able to take the existing things in one pot and then give one license which protects the former software base, but also the new silicon. So the idea is that tomorrow you can go in a shop, buy a router, you open the package, and on the chip that is in the router, you find a link where you can download the full design of that chip and being able to verify it completely on your own. Only then your freedoms will be real, and you will be empowered to study, modify it, and trust this chip. That's the idea. This cannot happen today with just the GPL. More questions? Yep.
I think you briefly mentioned hobbyist use before in your presentation. Is there any realistic means that a hobbyist could produce his or her own chip? Maybe not now, maybe in the future even?
Thanks for the question. For the sake of time, I didn't mention some projects. One of them is eFabless, and you can look on the internet for, there are beautiful videos like zerotoasics.com. So there are already some companies making some money, being sustainable already, making what a sort of MPWs, multi-project wafer. So basically they assembled many designs from people and they fabricated at a very cheap cost. So for something like €1,000, you can get your chip. And you can also think tomorrow to make some community coming together. Like everyone wants to get a router. I'm paranoid about routers. I would like to have a secure router and really trust it. So how about we come 10,000 people together, we fund that chip, and just we get it done. So basically we can share the cost. So I think it's certainly not as easy as in software. You just need GCC and you compile things, you get your binary done. It's more complex. You need to pay money to get the chip. But I still think the barrier is low enough to really do something.